I'm going to tell you what happened in December of 1987, and I'm going to tell it as straight as I can. Because my mother spent 32 years trying to find the right words and never quite got there. What she left me was a handwritten account, about 40 pages, legal pad, pencil. Some of it is crossed out, some of it is rewritten in the margins. There are places where the handwriting gets so small and tight, it's almost unreadable, like she was trying to compress something that wouldn't compress, and there are places where it opens up wide and the letters are shaken. She died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. She was 61. In the weeks before she went, she handed me those pages and she said, "I don't need you to believe me. I just need someone to have it." I believed her. I believed her before I finished the first page. I'm going to tell you why. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Her name was Lorraine Mead. She grew up in Enumclaw, Washington, a small town at the base of the Cascade foothills, about an hour southeast of Seattle. Enumclaw is the kind of place that people from cities drive through on their way to the mountains and don't stop. It has a main street with a feed store and a hardware store and a diner that's been the same diner since the 1960s. It has a rodeo grounds. It has a water tower. The surrounding country is farmland on the flat, and then immediately foothills that climb fast into real wilderness. You can stand in the Safeway parking lot and see Mount Rainier on clear days, which is not nothing. It's the kind of view that reminds you every time that the flat agricultural valley you're standing in is just a seam in something much older and much larger. She grew up there in the 50s and 60s, the daughter of a man named Walt Birdsell, who worked for the timber company and hunted deer every fall, and kept a large garden that Lorraine and her sister Patrice were put to work in from the time they could carry a bucket. She was practical by upbringing. She knew how to read weather. She knew how to clean a fish and how to set a fence post, and how to tell from the sound of a creek whether it was running high or low without being able to see it. The outdoors was not romantic to her. It was just where things happened. She met my father when she was 19 at a company barbecue where he worked. He was good-looking and charming, and he had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. That's what she wrote. He had a way. She also wrote that she didn't understand until several years in that the opposite of that feeling, being made to feel like the least important person in any room, was where the real man lived. His name was Gerald. I'm not going to call him my father in this story because the word doesn't fit what I know of him. Gerald Mead. He worked maintenance at the Weyerhaeuser mill in Enumclaw for 9 years. He liked hunting. He liked whiskey. And when things didn't go his way, which in his view was most of the time, he liked making sure everyone in his immediate vicinity understood exactly how bad he felt about it. My mother had 2 kids with him, me and my older sister, Tina. Tina was 8 in December of 1987. I was 6. We were living by then in a rented house on a county road outside Greenwater, which is barely a place, just a cluster of houses and a gas station on State Route 410, maybe 20 miles east of Enumclaw, on the way up toward Chinook Pass. The Cascades are right there. You can see Mount Rainier on clear days. The forests come down close to the road on both sides, and the winters are hard, and the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. That distance was part of why Gerald wanted to live there. The house outside Greenwater was a rental built for logging-era workers and never updated. Single-pane windows that sweated ice on the inside in January. A wood stove in the living room that was the only heat source that worked reliably. The previous tenants had left a broken chest freezer on the back porch, and Gerald always meant to haul it away, and never did. In winter, it was something else. The road turned to mud in November, and stayed mud until April. The nearest grocery was back in Enumclaw, 20 miles on a 2-lane highway that could close in a bad storm. Gerald did the shopping on weekends when he felt like it, which was not always on a predictable schedule. My mother learned to keep the pantry stocked against the weeks when he didn't feel like it. She learned a lot of things out there that she hadn't expected to need to know. Tina told me once that winter in that house smelled like wood smoke and wet boots and tension. She said that's how she thinks of it, those 3 things together. I don't have a smell memory of it myself, or if I do, it's mixed up with other things. What I have is a memory of the quiet, of how quiet the house got at certain times of day, and how that quiet was not the same as the quiet of the woods outside. I'm going to skip over most of what happened in that house because it isn't my story to tell in detail, and because my mother didn't write it in detail. What she wrote was this: on the night of December 14th, 1987, after a particular sequence of events she described only as the worst yet, she made a decision. She packed what she could carry in a canvas duffel, took Tina and me, and walked out the back door into the dark. She didn't take the car. The car was Gerald's, and Gerald was passed out in the bedroom, but she was afraid of the sound of the engine waking him. She was also afraid of what would happen if he caught her on the road. A logging road in December at midnight with 2 children in the car was still a better option than the car. She had made this calculation very quickly, the way she made calculations quickly when she needed to, and the answer had come back clean. There is something I want to say here about the choice of the woods specifically, because it was December, and the woods were dark and cold, and she had no equipment for them. She could have walked down the road. She could have knocked on the neighbor's door, the family with the horses 1/2 mile south. She could have tried for the highway and flagged a car. She didn't. She went into the woods, and in the pages she addresses this directly, because she'd thought about it herself in the years since. She wrote, "I've asked myself why I went into the trees instead of the road. The honest answer is that the road was his. He knew every inch of that road, and he'd driven it drunk at 3 in the morning, looking for me once before, the previous February, and I'd had to hide in the ditch with the kids for 20 minutes while he passed. The trees were not his. He hated them. Always said there was nothing in the woods worth going into the woods for. So I went into what he wouldn't follow me into." That is a lucid and practical piece of reasoning made by a frightened woman in the middle of the night, and I want to honor it as such. She didn't go into the woods because she had a plan for the woods. She went into the woods because she knew the woods weren't his, and that single fact made them safer than the road. She was right about that. He never followed them. She didn't take the road either. The road went past the front windows, and she wasn't sure enough that he was asleep. What she took was the forest trail behind the house that she and Tina had walked in summer, a 2-track that ran back into the Clearwater State Forest land that bordered the property. She had a flashlight, some cash, a change of clothes each for us, some crackers and peanut butter, and a butcher knife she'd taken from the kitchen drawer. She was 30 years old. It was around midnight. The temperature was in the upper 20s. There was 3 inches of snow on the ground and more coming down. She had no plan except distance. She wrote that she didn't think about where she was going. She thought about how far she could get before he woke up. She'd thought about leaving before. She'd thought about it the way you think about a door you know is there but haven't decided yet whether to go through. The thinking had always stopped at the practical problems. No car she could take, no money to speak of, no place lined up. Patrice was in Enumclaw, but Gerald knew where Patrice lived, which made Patrice's house a place he'd look first. She'd thought about the women's shelter in Auburn, but she didn't know how far it was, and she didn't know if she could get us there without being seen, and she hadn't let herself plan past that point, because planning meant deciding, and she hadn't decided. What happened on December 14th was not something she decided. She was very clear about that in the pages. She wrote, "I did not decide to leave. My body decided. Something went wrong enough, and my body stood up and started moving, and the rest of me caught up somewhere between the kitchen and the back door." What she remembered from those minutes was specific. The drawer where the knives were, the particular sound it made when she pulled it open, the weight of the butcher knife, the canvas duffel under the bed, and what she knew was in it because she'd been putting things in it for weeks without admitting to herself why. She remembered how quiet the bedroom was when she looked in before she left. The sound of Gerald breathing, the certainty that she needed to be very far from that sound before he stopped making it. She wrote, "I looked at my children's boots by the door and I thought about whether we'd need them, and then I thought, we're going to need everything we have. I put the boots on them while they were still mostly asleep." Tina says she remembers being put into her coat and boots in the dark. She says she knew enough not to ask questions. Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video. Tina remembered some of what happened. She's 53 now, and she lives in Olympia, and she's the one who first suggested I tell this publicly. I talked to her for probably 10 hours over a few months, trying to fill in the parts that weren't in the pages. She was 8 that night, old enough to understand that something serious was happening, old enough to be quiet when Mom said to be quiet. I was 6. I have fragments. I have snow. I have my mother's hand around mine, very tight. I have cold air and pine smell, and the sound of our boots and nothing else. What I have from my mother is 40 pages of handwriting. The trail behind the house ran northeast, which in that country means up and in. The Clearwater State Forest is roughly 12,000 acres of second-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. It's bordered on its eastern side by the William O. Douglas Wilderness, which is part of the Wenatchee National Forest. The terrain goes up fast once you're off the county road level. Hills, drainages, a creek called Huckleberry Creek that runs down through a shallow valley about 2 miles in. The 2-track that my mother was following was used by deer hunters in the fall and by logging equipment a decade prior, before the timber company gave up the lease. She followed it for about 45 minutes by her estimate before the flashlight started going. The batteries were cold. The beam went from a clear white cone to a dull yellow smear, and she could see maybe 10 feet ahead of her in the snow. The snow was still coming down, light, steady. The trees on both sides were dark shapes, and the trail was recognizable only because the snow lay smoother there than in the brush on either side. She wrote that she stopped at some point and listened for headlights on the road below, for a car engine, for Gerald's voice calling out. Nothing, just the sound of snow in the branches. She said it was the quietest place she'd ever stood. Then the flashlight died. She had no backup. The dark closed in completely. She wrote that she stood still for what felt like a long time, letting her eyes try to adjust, which they did, slowly. The snow itself gave off a faint ambient light, the way snow does when it's heavy enough. She could make out the trees, barely. She could see the trail as a slightly lighter path through the darker forest on either side. She kept walking. There's a thing that happens to the body in sustained cold and sustained fear together. My mother wrote about it in detail, and I think she wrote about it in detail because she'd been turning it over for 30 years, and it was one of the parts she could describe precisely, unlike other parts of the night. She said the fear was clarifying at first. It burned off everything that wasn't necessary and left her with just the next step and the one after that. She wasn't thinking about what Gerald would do when he woke up. She wasn't thinking about where they were going to sleep in a week or how she was going to afford a lawyer. She was thinking about the trail and the dark and the weight of the two of us beside her. She said at some point she realized she was talking out loud. Just murmuring, she wrote, steady low sound, something she'd apparently been doing for a while before she noticed. She wasn't saying anything specific, just maintaining a kind of sound presence in the dark, the way you might hum while working alone at night. She thought afterward that it was probably some very old instinct, some animal knowledge that sound means you're alive, and if you can hear yourself, you can keep going. Tina says she remembers that sound. She says it was the thing that kept her from being completely terrified. Not the words, which there weren't any, just the fact of her mother's voice, low and steady, still going. The two-track was narrowing. She hadn't noticed it narrowing, but it had, the way trails do when they haven't been used in a long time, and the brush comes in from both sides a little more each season. The tire ruts she'd been reading as the path through the snow were getting closer together, and the tree trunks on both sides were closer. She was still following it, but it was getting to be more of an act of interpretation than navigation. Then the flashlight died. The cold was the main problem. She'd dressed us for it, layered us up before we left the house, but the cold at that elevation, in December above Greenwater, doesn't care how many layers you have. It soaks in slow and steady, and after the first hour you start to feel it in your feet and your hands, and eventually in your thinking. She wrote that she was working hard to stay focused on the trail. Her mind kept pulling toward warmth, toward the house, and she had to keep redirecting it. That house is not warm. That house is not safe. Keep moving. Tina says she was scared, but not crying. She says she knew not to cry. I don't know what I was doing. Tina thinks I was half asleep, being half carried by my mother. That sounds right to me. There's a particular quality to being lost at night in the woods that my mother described in a way I've never seen anyone else describe it. She said it was less like being lost and more like the world shrinking to the size of the next few feet. Everything beyond the immediate ground was hypothetical. The trail existed because she was walking something that felt smoother than the brush on either side of it, and she was walking it because stopping was not a viable option, and that was the entire extent of what she knew for certain. She counted her steps at some point. She'd read once that counting steps helped you estimate distance, and she was trying to hold on to anything that felt like information. She got to somewhere in the 400s before she lost count and started over. She gave up on the counting eventually. It wasn't giving her what she needed, which was some sense of progress, some way of knowing she was getting somewhere. The dark doesn't give you that. The dark just gives you more dark. Tina was flagging beside her. She wasn't complaining, but she was slowing in a way that meant her legs were giving out. She was 8 and she'd been up since before midnight, and she'd been moving through snow and cold for the better part of an hour. My mother picked her up periodically and carried her for stretches. She wrote, she was 48 pounds. I know that exactly, because I'd just had her at the doctor the week before for an earache, and they weighed her. 48 pounds for a few dozen steps at a time. Then I'd put her down, and we'd both walk again. She was keeping track of me, too. She had my hand, or had it periodically when the trail was wide enough to walk side by side, and she could feel by the grip whether I was still with her or starting to go. She wrote that I went quiet at some point, which was not like me, and she picked me up and carried both of us for a stretch, which she said she didn't know she could do until she was doing it. They went off the 2-track at some point. My mother didn't realize it immediately. The snow had filled the ruts enough that the surface looked continuous, and she took a turn that the trail didn't take. She ended up going down a slope into a drainage through a section of dense young cedar, the kind of tight dog hair stand where the branches interlock at shoulder height and you have to push through them. She got Tina and me through. Her coat was soaked by the time they came out the other side. At the bottom of the drainage was the creek, Huckleberry Creek, running dark and shallow over rocks, no ice on it because the water was moving too fast. She could hear it before she could see it. This is where the account gets specific in a way that's hard to explain, except that my mother was a specific person and she wrote what she observed. She sat down on a log at the creek bank, and she was trying to figure out what to do next. She could hear the creek. She could see maybe 15 feet in the ambient snow light. Tina was sitting beside her. I was apparently still half asleep on her lap. She heard something cross the creek upstream. She described the sound as a single deliberate crossing, not splashing the way a deer splashes, not the frantic multiple contact sound of something running through water, one step, maybe two, in fast succession, and then silence on the other side. She said it was heavy. She could hear the displacement even from where she was sitting. Whatever it wasn't small. She reached into the duffel and got the butcher knife. She described the feeling of getting it out in the dark, finding the handle by touch, getting the blade oriented without cutting herself. She'd never thought of herself as someone who would hold a weapon in the dark over her children. She wrote, I held it, and I thought, if something comes, I will use this. And I didn't feel fear when I thought it. I felt very clear. She thought about shouting. She thought about it and then didn't do it. Shouting would mean noise, and noise might mean Gerald, who could have woken up by then, who could have come looking on the road, and who would know every path from the house as well as she did. She didn't know how far they were from the road. In the dark, distance was unreliable. She wrote that she sat very still and watched the upstream darkness. Nothing moved. The snow kept coming down. The creek ran. After a few minutes, she started to wonder if she'd heard anything at all, if the cold and the exhaustion weren't playing with her. She was considering that when the smell hit her. She said it was like nothing she'd encountered before, and she'd lived her whole life in Cascade foothills country, had grown up hunting with her father, had cleaned deer and elk, and knew what blood and glands smelled like. This was different. Musky was the word she used first. Then she crossed it out and wrote animal, then crossed that out too. What she settled on was a wet, heavy smell, like if you took a barnyard and put it deep in the ground for a season. She wrote that it was overwhelming for about 10 seconds, and then it receded slightly, like whatever was carrying it had moved back a little. She said she felt a pressure, not wind, not temperature, a pressure like the air between her and the tree line to her right had changed quality, like something large was very close and very still. She did not run. She wrote that she thought about running and that her body refused to do it. Not from fear, exactly, or not only from fear, she wrote. Something in me said that running was the wrong answer, and I had learned enough about wrong answers to listen when something said that. So she sat. She described the sitting in more detail than almost anything else in the pages. I think because the waiting was the thing she'd had the most time to think about since. She sat on the log with the butcher knife in both hands and her back straight, and she breathed through her nose the way she'd learned to breathe when she needed to think, slow and deliberate, trying to hear past the sound of her own pulse. The smell was the thing. Once you were past the first shock of it, it didn't leave. It settled into the air around the log and stayed. She wrote that it had layers. The top note was the wet barnyard smell she'd described, heavy and close. But underneath that was something else she had more trouble putting words to. She tried twice and crossed them both out. The third version read, something alive in a way that felt very old, the way old libraries smell old, like time had a scent, and this was what a great deal of it smelled like. She wrote that the smell made her feel small, not frightened, or not only frightened. Small in the way you sometimes feel in truly big country, in high mountains, or at the edge of the ocean at night, when the scale of things that were here before you, and will be here after you becomes briefly physical, and your body registers it without your permission. She kept the knife pointed toward where she thought the smell was coming from. She was under no illusions about what good a kitchen knife would do. But she held it because it was the only thing she had that was the shape of a decision. Tina was beside her, not speaking. She was 8 and she had her mother's arm, and she was keeping still the way she'd learned to keep still when stillness was what was needed. My mother wrote, she knew something was out there. I could feel her knowing it. We sat there together knowing it, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that was better than silence. The creek ran, the snow came down, the smell breathed in and out, like whatever was carrying it was breathing. The pressure lasted maybe 10 minutes, then it eased, and then it was gone, the smell and the pressure both, and the forest was just a forest again, creek and snow and dark. She stayed at that log for a while longer. Then she got us up and started moving again. The thing is, she knew she was lost by then. The drainage she'd followed down to the creek ran roughly north-south, but she'd gotten turned around coming through the cedar, and she wasn't sure which direction she'd come from or which way led back to anything. She followed the creek downstream, which was the right instinct. Creeks led out eventually, but the terrain in that drainage got rocky and steep pretty fast, and she ended up on a hillside above the creek, where the footing was uncertain and the snow hid what was underneath. This is roughly where my memory becomes clearer. I remember being awake, and I remember the cold, and I remember my mother stopping and sitting down against a big fir tree, and I remember she was shaking. Not just cold shaking. Her jaw was set, and she had the look she sometimes had when she was keeping everything inside, and it was very full. Tina says she thinks it was around 3 in the morning by then, maybe 3:30. They'd been out for 3 hours, and they were a couple miles in at least, in rough country, in the dark, in snow, and the temperature had dropped further. My mother was wet from pushing through the cedar stand, and she was losing heat faster than she could generate it. She wrote that she made the decision to stop moving. She wrote this, "There's a point where movement costs more than it gains, and you have to stop and let your body do what it can with what heat is left. I learned that from my father. I sat us down against the biggest tree I could find, and I got the two of them inside my coat as best I could, and I told Tina to stay awake, and I told her we would be fine. She told Tina they would be fine because she needed Tina to believe it. She herself was not sure. That's when the branches moved. She heard it before she saw anything, a sound from uphill, maybe 60 feet up the slope. Branches moving, but not the random movement of wind in branches, something passing through them, something large. The sound moved down the slope toward them, then stopped. Then the smell came back. She had the knife out. She wrote that she was ready to use it if something came at them, which she knew even as she thought it was close to a useless gesture. Whatever was coming through those branches was not something a butcher knife was going to stop. Nothing came at them. Instead, something set a branch on fire. I know how that sounds. Let me be precise about what she wrote, because she was precise. She wrote that she heard a sound she couldn't identify, like a very dry stick being twisted, and then there was light, not the yellow light of an open flame. A small, contained brightness, the way a campfire looks in its first 5 minutes when it's finding itself. She could see by it before she understood what she was looking at. A branch had been broken from a standing dead tree about 20 feet away and leaned against a boulder with smaller material around its base. It was burning, steadily, with more confidence than newly lit wood usually has, which she took to mean it had been lit with something other than a match, something that caught the dry inner wood fast. She could see by it. She could feel the heat reach them from 20 feet away. She could also see the tree line 30 feet beyond the fire, and she could see shapes in it, not clearly, but the bulk of something dark against dark, more than one. Still, the fire burned for a long time, longer than a single branch should burn in conditions like that. My mother wrote that she kept waiting for it to die down, and it kept not dying. She got Tina and me close to it, close enough that we stopped shaking. She fed small pieces of bark into the base of it when the flame lowered, and she had enough sense from her outdoor upbringing to know how to keep a fire going once someone else had started it. She did not approach the tree line. She wrote about managing the fire for what she estimated was several hours. It was not like tending a campfire she'd built. This fire had been built by something that knew what it was doing, structured in a way that burned evenly from the bottom, and her job was maintenance rather than construction. She found that the base of the fire was laid across 2 small rocks in a way that let air underneath, which is the thing most people get wrong when they're in a hurry, and the dead branch that formed the spine of it was pitchy enough that it held heat and kept radiating even when the outer wood burned down to coals. She fed small pieces to it when the flame lowered. She went through the brush around her by feel in the dark, reaching out from the log as far as she could, finding dead twigs and bark fragments, not going more than a few feet because she didn't want to move too much. The woods had gone very quiet around the fire. Whatever sounds there had been before, the creak of branches and the occasional drip of snow melt and the far-off creak of a tree settling in the cold, had stilled to something underneath that she described as a listening quality, like the air itself was attending to something. Tina slept against her for a while and then woke and sat up and was quiet. I was asleep in my mother's lap with the blanket from the duffel over both of us, and my mother kept one hand on my back, feeling my breathing, and the other hand on the knife. And she watched the tree line, and the fire, and the tree line, and let the hours go. She wrote about what she thought about during those hours. She thought about her father, who had taken her camping in the Cascades when she was about Tina's age, up in the William O. Douglas Wilderness Country, and who had showed her how to read terrain, and how to find water, and how to navigate by ridge lines. She hadn't thought about those lessons in years. She was thinking about them now, running through what she knew the way you run through a checklist, taking inventory. She knew the creek was water. She knew that moving water meant there was a drainage, and drainages led somewhere. She knew that in the morning she could follow the creek out. She thought about her mother, who had been dead for 3 years by then, and who had never known Gerald was what he was because my mother had not said so. She thought about Patrice, and what Patrice's voice would sound like on the phone when she called in the morning. She wrote, "I thought about a lot of things that night that I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. Something about the fire made it possible. The light, maybe. Or the fact of it. The fact that there was warmth and light in the dark and I had not made it. And something had made it for us. And all I had to do was keep it going." She wrote that she did not cry that night. She had expected to cry. She wrote, "I thought I would be frightened enough to cry, but I wasn't frightened in the way I'd expected to be frightened. I was watchful. I was very awake. I was cold in my feet and my lower back, and I was watching the tree line, and I was thinking about my father showing me how to read a slope, and I was keeping the fire going. That was all. It was enough." She wrote that she could hear sounds from beyond the fire, very low sounds, occasional. She described them as vocalization, and then in parentheses added, "Not language I've heard, but organized, like something being discussed." She was a practical woman, and she used precise language when she could find it. At dawn, which comes late in December in the Cascades, maybe 7:30, the light started to gray in from above. My mother had been awake all night. The fire had burned down to coals. She and Tina and I were cold again, but not dangerously so. She could see enough to identify where the creek was below her, and roughly where the slope led up. When she looked at the tree line, it was empty. There were tracks in the snow. She described them. She was a hunter's daughter, and she knew track shapes. She wrote, "Bipedal, 2 parallel lines of prints, each individual print roughly 16 to 17 inches long with 5 clear toe impressions, heel narrow, stride approximately 4 feet between prints. 2 sets, possibly 3. It was hard to tell because the snow had softened overnight." The tracks came to within about 20 feet of where they'd sheltered. They didn't come closer. She stood and looked at them for a long time. She was exhausted in a way that made her careful, because she knew exhaustion could make her misread things, and she wanted to read them correctly. She walked to the nearest clear print and crouched beside it. She put her bare hand next to it in the snow, spread as wide as she could spread it. She described her hand as not covering 2/3 of the print's width. She described the toe impressions as clear and deep, each one with a distinct pressure point at its tip that suggested something hard and narrow there, a nail or a pad structure she didn't have a category for. The depth of the impressions was greater at the ball of the foot than the heel, which she noted in the pages, though she said at the time she didn't know what that meant. She knew it was a detail, and she filed it away. 2 sets of prints, possibly 3. She traced their paths as best she could, reading back from where they stopped toward where they'd come from. They came down the slope from uphill, from the direction she'd heard the branches moving in the night. They came to the 20-foot mark, and they stopped. Not in a way that suggested they'd paused and then moved on, but in a way that suggested they'd stood. The impressions at the stopping point were deeper and slightly spread, the weight of something standing still. She stood there in the early light, in the cold, in a burned-out drainage above a creek she didn't know the name of, and she thought about what had stood there in the dark on the other side of the fire line, and she thought, it watched us all night. And then she thought, and we're alive. That was the entirety of what she concluded that morning. She didn't have a name for what it was. She had the tracks, and she had the fire, and she had the knowledge, sudden and solid, that whatever those things were, they had been on the right side of something. She followed the creek downstream that morning. She had Tina on one side and me on the other, and we walked for about 90 minutes and came out at a Forest Service pullout on a gravel road that eventually connected to SR 410. A DNR truck found them there around 10 in the morning. The driver was a Forest Service wildlife tech named Dale Forsyth, who was checking elk survey plots in the area. He wrapped us in emergency blankets from his truck and drove us to the ranger station in Greenwater, which was barely more than a building with a phone, and my mother called her sister in Enumclaw from there. Gerald Mead never came after them. He didn't call the police because calling the police would have meant questions about the night before. He was gone from the rental house within a week, and my mother never saw him again. He died in 2004. I know because she found out and wrote it in the margin of the legal pad, next to an unrelated sentence, in smaller writing than usual. My mother wrote a few pages about the morning, the walk out, and the ranger station, that I want to include here because I think they matter. She said the walk down to the road took longer than she expected. The creek trail was clear enough once the light came in, but the terrain was harder than it looked in the snow, and she was spent in a way she'd never been before, the kind of tired that lives under the muscles and not in them. She carried me for the last half-mile, she wrote, because my boots were wet and my feet had gone numb, and I'd stopped complaining about it, which was the thing that frightened her more than the complaining had. Tina walked beside her and didn't say much. Tina has told me that the walk out felt like coming back from a long way away. She said the world started up again in stages, birds first, then the sound of the road somewhere below them, then the cold taking on a different quality, drier and more open, and then the gravel pull-out and the ordinary gray sky. Dale Forsyth's DNR truck was already pulled over when they came out of the tree line. He'd seen them before they'd seen him. He was out of the truck by the time they reached the road. My mother didn't remember exactly what she said to him. Something minimal, she thought. She and her girls had gotten turned around on a night hike and spent the night out. He didn't push on it. She wrote, he looked at us, and he looked at our clothes, and he got the blankets out of the truck without asking any more questions. He was the kind of man who understood that what you don't ask is sometimes the kindest thing. He drove them to the Greenwater Ranger Station, which was a small building on the highway with a wood stove and a payphone mounted on the outside wall. He got the stove going while my mother called her sister. Tina and I sat on a bench with the blankets and watched the stove. The station had a hand-painted sign on the wall listing the names of the volunteer fire crews who'd worked the local district since 1952. My mother sat on a stool by the phone and waited for her sister to answer and watched the stove and held the phone against her ear and didn't say anything about the night, because there was nothing she could say that didn't start with the fire, and she wasn't ready to start there. Her sister Patrice got there around 1 in the afternoon. Patrice asked once what happened, and my mother said they'd had to leave and they'd gotten lost in the woods and they'd made it out. Patrice looked at her for a moment and then said, "Okay," and got us into her car. That was the end of it for a long time. I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to be careful about the next part. What I've told you so far is what can be verified, or at least corroborated. The general geography is real. Huckleberry Creek is a real drainage in the Clearwater State Forest east of Enumclaw. The William O. Douglas Wilderness is real and borders that forest. The distances and terrain my mother described are consistent with that area. Dale Forsyth was a real person. My aunt remembers his name from the day she came to pick us up, and I found a reference to him in a 1990 Forest Service newsletter about wildlife monitoring in that district. He retired in 1997. I tried to find him to ask about the day he picked up a woman and 2 kids from a pullout on that road. But I was too late. He died in 2015. What I can't verify is the fire, or the tracks, or the shapes in the tree line. What I can verify is a fair amount of the surrounding context, and I want to be specific about that, because specificity is what my mother gave me, and I want to honor it. The Weyerhaeuser Mill in Enumclaw is real. Weyerhaeuser ran operations in the Enumclaw area through the 1970s and into the 1980s, primarily timber processing. Gerald Mead as an individual is not something I can verify from public records, and I'm not trying to. He was real in the way people are real when they leave a physical absence behind them, a week-empty rental and no forwarding address. The Greenwater area is exactly as my mother described it. State Route 410 runs through it on its way to Chinook Pass, which is the mountain pass east of Enumclaw that connects to the eastern Cascades and closes in winter. Greenwater itself is a handful of houses and a small general store and a Forest Service facility that's been there in various configurations for decades. The county roads that branch off 410 before you get to Greenwater proper do pass through private timber land that borders the Clearwater State Forest. I drove them. The Clearwater State Forest boundary is where my mother said it was. The forest is managed by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources and has been since the DNR took over management of state trust lands in the mid-20th century. Its eastern edge does border the William O. Douglas Wilderness, which is designated federal wilderness land in the Wenatchee National Forest. The wilderness boundary in that area is roughly where the terrain gets steep enough that commercial timber stopped being viable. What I can tell you is that my mother was not a storyteller in the embellishing sense. She was methodical. She was reserved. She was the kind of person who, when you asked her to describe something, described it in careful, plain terms, and stopped when she ran out of terms. She didn't pad. She didn't dramatize. The 40 pages she left me have the feeling of someone doing inventory, not performance. And she spent 32 years carrying this without telling anyone except Tina, and eventually me. Tina's memory of that night is fragmented, the way an 8-year-old's memory of a traumatic event often is. She remembers cold. She remembers the fire appearing. She remembers feeling that they were being watched, but not feeling afraid of it, which she said was strange to her, even as a child, because she expected to feel afraid. She doesn't remember specific shapes or sounds from beyond the fire. What she does remember is this. At some point during the night, she looked up and said something was standing just at the edge of the light. She didn't wake my mother. She just looked at it for a while. She said it was very tall. She said it didn't move. And she said after a while she felt something she couldn't explain, which she described to me as like being told it's okay without anyone using words. Then she went back to sleep. That detail took me a long time to sit with. I kept coming back to it, and I kept not knowing what to do with it. The intellectual part of me wanted to explain it away as a child's coping mechanism, the mind simplifying a threat into something manageable. Children do that. They're remarkably good at it. They don't have the same relationship to danger that adults have, partly because they don't fully understand consequences yet, and that incomprehension can function like armor. But Tina, at 53, describes that moment the same way she described it to me when she was 30, the first time we talked about the night in depth. The feeling doesn't change with age or language or the accumulation of better words. What she felt is what she felt, and what she felt was not the simplification of a child managing fear. She says it was more like information, like being told something that turned out to be true. And she was right. The night did end. Morning did come. Something in those woods kept its distance and kept the fire going, and did not come through the 20 feet of snow between the tree line and where they slept. She was right about all of it. She knew before she went to sleep, from the presence of that shape at the edge of the light, that she was right. That is a remarkable thing for an 8-year-old to know in those circumstances, and I don't have a comfortable explanation for how she knew it. My mother wrote about Tina's sleep in the pages. She watched her daughter slide back down against her shoulder and close her eyes, and she wrote, "I thought she was more afraid than she was showing. I thought she had collapsed from exhaustion. And then I heard her breathing slow the way it does when she's actually asleep, and I realized she just went back to sleep. She just decided it was all right and went to sleep." She wrote, "I thought then that children know things we don't know anymore, or they know them in a way we've learned to argue ourselves out of." Tina looked at that shape and went back to sleep, and I spent the rest of the night awake with a knife on my knee. And probably she had more information than I did. I want to spend some time on what my mother thought this was, because she thought about it for a long time, and she came to her own conclusions, which I'm going to share without endorsing or contesting them. She grew up in Enumclaw in the 1960s and 70s, and she knew the Cascade foothills country the way people who grow up in it know it, practically, seasonally, the way you know a neighbor. She knew what lived in those woods. She knew the difference between a black bear and a cougar in the dark because she'd seen both. She knew the size a male elk makes moving through brush. She knew the sounds a mountain lion makes, which are not sounds you forget easily. She wrote this: "Whatever built that fire was not a bear, and was not a cougar, and was not an elk, and was not a person I could see or call out to. It moved on 2 legs, and it was not built like a person." I have thought about this for 32 years. I have read what there is to read. I believe it was what the Puyallup and the Muckleshoot people have a name for, a name I didn't know then, and that I'm going to choose not to write down here, because writing it down seems presumptuous, like I'm borrowing something that doesn't belong to me. But they've known about these things for a long time, and the things they say about them match what I saw. She didn't go further than that. She was not a person who reached for grand interpretations. She said what she saw, and she said what she believed, and she let it sit there. I'll add what I know. The Puyallup tribe, whose traditional territory includes the area south of Mount Rainier and the foothills where that night took place, has recorded oral histories involving large forest-dwelling beings that are neither animal nor human. The Muckleshoot, who hold traditional land in the area, including the Green River watershed immediately west of the Clearwater Forest, have similar traditions. These aren't the generic Bigfoot of tourist T-shirts. The descriptions in those traditions involve beings that are aware, that have relationships with place, that operate according to their own understanding of territory and arrangement. I'm not an expert in those traditions, and I'm not going to summarize them in more depth than that, because I'd get things wrong. What I'll say is that my mother's instinct to not just apply the pop culture label to what she saw seems right to me. Whatever was on that hillside in December of 1987 had enough awareness to read a situation, to recognize what it was looking at, and to respond to it in a way that cost it something. It revealed itself. It lit a fire. It stayed close enough all night to be sure the fire kept working, which means it stayed close enough all night. And it didn't approach. My mother wrote in the pages, "I've tried to think about what it got out of this, if anything. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe there are things in the world that respond to need the way water responds to a drainage, just the way they're built, without calculating return. I don't know. What I know is that we were alive in the morning and we shouldn't have been, and something in those trees made that true. I've been to that area twice since she died. Once in summer, which doesn't feel like the right time for this kind of visit. But I couldn't get there in winter. Once in late October of 2022, when the snow had started to come down on the high ridges, and the forest below was in that transitional state where the deciduous brush goes bare, and the conifers go dark, and the whole place has a quality of closed-off quiet that I can't describe except to say it doesn't feel empty. It feels like presence. Like the absence of sound and movement is not the absence of anything, but a choice. I stood at the drainage where I thought the creek was, based on my mother's description and the topography, and I didn't hear anything, and I didn't see anything. But I understood, standing there, why she believed what she believed. That country is old and dense, and it operates on its own terms. And the idea that something lives in it that we haven't cataloged, something that's been there longer than we've been anywhere near it, doesn't strike me as impossible. It strikes me as the most natural thing in the world. I brought something and I left it there. I'm not going to say what. That felt private. Here's what I've been thinking about since I started putting this together. My mother's account sits inside a recognizable pattern of reported encounters that I didn't know anything about until after she died. She didn't know about it either. Or if she did, she didn't reference it. She wasn't part of any community of believers or researchers. She wasn't trying to fit her experience into anyone else's framework. She was just writing down what happened. But when I started reading, not the pop culture stuff, the actual first-person accounts collected by researchers like John Bindernagel, who spent decades studying primate evidence in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest. As a credentialed wildlife biologist, I found things that changed how I held my mother's account. The specific details she recorded appear again and again, independently, from people who have no reason to be telling the same story, who spent decades studying primate evidence in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest, or the accounts in the BFRO database that come from similar terrain and similar periods. What I found was that the specific details my mother recorded appear again and again, independently, from people who have no reason to be telling the same story. The smell, the pressure before the thing shows itself, the way it stays at the edge of visibility rather than approaching, the bipedal tracks with the specific proportions she described, The long toe impressions, the narrow heel, the stride length. The fact that it didn't attack, the sense not of threat but of assessment, and in a smaller number of accounts, particularly ones from people in distress, a quality that I don't have a better word for than protective. Not aggressive, not curious, something more like responsive. What I'll say is this: the accounts I'm talking about predate my mother's experience, and they come from people with no knowledge of each other and no shared motive for telling the same story. They're not the dramatic confrontation accounts. They're the quiet ones, where something large and intelligent made contact in a way that stopped short of confrontation, and where the person describing it uses words like watching and assessing and curious rather than charging and terrifying. My mother's account belongs to this subset, a presence that revealed itself incrementally. A fire built at a distance, a watch maintained, 20 feet of snow between the tree line and the people who needed warmth, and that distance held all night. There's a researcher named Paul Freeman who worked in the Blue Mountains of Washington and Oregon in the 1990s and documented track castings in that region that were later analyzed by Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University. Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology, and he's one of the few credentialed academics who has worked seriously with physical evidence in this area. His analysis of those tracks, and of tracks from other locations collected over decades, identifies consistent anatomical features that don't match any known species and that are difficult to fake at scale. A mid-tarsal pressure ridge consistent with a flexible foot, toe splay patterns suggesting a dynamic walking gait, unlike any large primate in the known record, depth distributions in the impressions indicating a weight well beyond what a human could generate, even with fabricated footwear. The tracks my mother described from the hillside above Huckleberry Creek, 16 to 17 inches, 5 toes, narrow heel, 4-foot stride, fall within the range documented from hundreds of independent reports across 6 decades of the Pacific Northwest. I'm not arguing for anything specific here. I'm telling you what I found when I looked. What I'll say is this: my mother was 30 years old in December of 1987. She was cold and lost and frightened, and she had 2 small children and a butcher knife, and no plan. Something in a forest above Greenwater. Washington built her a fire and stood watch, and let her live. Whatever that was, she was grateful for it her entire life. She wrote that at the end of the pages, in the last entry, which was dated about a month before she died. She wrote, "I never went back, and I don't know if that was right or wrong. I think about it sometimes, what it cost them to be seen, if that costs something for beings like that, and whether I owe something in return. Maybe telling the truth is the return. Maybe that's all I have to offer. But I want it on record that something in those woods was kind to us, and I spent 32 years being grateful for it, and I still am." That's the account as she left it. 40 handwritten pages. December 1987, the Clearwater State Forest east of Enumclaw, Washington. The legal pad is in a box in my house. I take it out sometimes. The handwriting is very neat in the beginning and gets harder to read toward the end. Not because she was uncertain, but because her hands were getting worse in those last months. She was trying to get it down before she couldn't anymore. I sat with those pages for a long time before I could read them straight through. What I found was that I was hearing her voice, her actual voice, the specific cadences of the way she talked. She wrote the way she spoke, and she spoke precisely, and reading the pages was like being in a room with her, like she had given me a way to sit across from her one more time. I read them in one sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me. By the time I got to the last entry, I was crying. Not from grief, exactly, but from something more like recognition. Like the account confirmed something I had known in some way for a long time, but had never had the words for. She got it down. I keep thinking about the fire, how it appeared, what it took to build it and light it in that snow, and then stay near enough to make sure it held. How many times in the night something enormous was standing on that hillside, watching over 3 people it had no reason to watch over, and didn't leave. I don't have a way to explain that inside any framework I know. I don't think my mother did either. She stopped trying to explain it a long time before she died, and just carried it as a thing that happened, a thing that was real, a debt she didn't know how to pay. I think about the tracks she described in the snow the next morning. 2 sets, possibly 3, coming to within 20 feet of where they'd sheltered and stopping there. Something that could have come closer and chose the distance. Something that understood what 20 feet meant to a frightened woman with a knife and a couple of small kids, and left exactly that much space between them. Tina thinks about it differently than I do. She said to me once during one of our conversations about this, that the thing she keeps coming back to isn't the fire or the smell or the tracks. It's the feeling she had when she looked up and saw that shape at the edge of the light. She said she was 8 years old and alone in the dark, in the cold, in the snow, and she should have been terrified, and instead she felt something she can only describe now as being told that the night was going to end. That morning was going to come. She went back to sleep. I've talked to Tina about that moment more than any other single moment in the story. More than the fire, more than the smell, more than any of it. Because it's the part I can't explain from the outside, and she can explain from the inside, and what she says about it keeps stopping me. Cold, no matter how many times I hear it. She says the shape at the edge of the light was very still. She says it didn't move while she watched it, and she watched it for what she thinks was several minutes, maybe longer. She was 8, and her time estimates from that night are not reliable, but the quality of the memory is. She says it was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to see the top of it, and she was seated, so that's from a low angle, which makes the height harder to judge. But it was substantial, and she says it was watching them, not watching her specifically, watching all 3 of them, the way something watches, when it's not hunting and not afraid, but is paying careful attention to something it has decided matters. She said the thing that hit her, the thing that made her feel what she felt, was that it seemed tired, not exhausted, but the particular tiredness of something that has been doing something for a long time and will continue doing it, and knows that. She said it reminded her of the way her grandfather had looked in the last years of his life when he was tending something, the garden, the woodpile, things he'd tended for 40 years and would tend until he couldn't. A settled, ongoing attention. She looked at it for a while, and then she went back to sleep because something in her decided the night was accounted for. I've asked her several times over the years whether she was afraid at all. In that moment, she always thinks about it genuinely, takes her time, and then says the same thing. She says no, and then she says, I think I knew it wasn't there for us in the way that things come for you. It was there in the way that a house is there. It was just where it was, and we were inside its attention, and that was okay. I don't have anything to add to that. I think she got it right. Maybe that's the most honest account of what happened. An 8-year-old looked at something enormous in the dark and understood it wasn't going to hurt them and went back to sleep. That kind of clarity is hard to argue with. My mother died in March of 2019. It was a Thursday. Tina and I were both there. She had been unconscious for most of the previous day, but she came back briefly in the morning and she knew where she was. She said a few things to each of us. To me, she said, "Make sure someone else has it." I'm working on that. The Clearwater State Forest is still there. The road up from Greenwater toward Chinook Pass is still there. The drainage that runs down to Huckleberry Creek is still there. The forest in that area is second growth, replanted after the clear-cut era, big enough now that you lose the sky within a few yards of the trail edge. The standing dead trees in drainage bottoms still dry out over decades into what loggers call pitchy snags, wood saturated with resin that catches fast and burns hot. That's real. That's what burns. What built the fire is still there too, or something like it. The Pacific Northwest has the highest density of documented Bigfoot reports per square mile of any region in North America. The Cascades, in particular, from the Mount Baker area in the north down through the Mount Adams country in the south, represent decades of consistent encounter accounts from people with no connection to each other. Loggers, hikers, hunters, and one woman fleeing a bad marriage on a cold night in December who needed a fire and got one. Whatever arrangement exists between those things and this forest, it's old. It predates the logging roads and the state forest boundary designations and the ranger stations and every other human thing that's been placed on top of that landscape. The Puyallup and Muckleshoot people knew about it before any of that. It was in their traditions for reasons that go deeper than campfire storytelling. My mother sensed that. She sensed it that night, and she respected it enough to never go back, never seek it out, never try to turn what happened into anything other than what it was, a debt and a gratitude and a silence she mostly kept. I've been less good at keeping it. Maybe she expected that. She gave me the pages. Here's what I want to say last. I've seen the way this subject gets treated. I know what happens when someone says the word out loud. I've watched people's faces change. There's a particular expression, polite and slightly pitying, that people put on when they're deciding you're credulous. I don't care about that. I cared about it before my mother died, and I stopped caring after. She was a precise person. She was not given to fantasy. She spent 32 years with a story she didn't tell because she knew how it would be received. And she spent those years grateful for something she couldn't name in terms that anyone else would accept. That seems like too long to spend in that kind of silence for something that wasn't real. The fire was real. The tracks were real. The shape at the edge of the light that an 8-year-old looked at and felt safe enough to sleep was real. Whatever it was, it made a choice. And my mother, and Tina, and I are here because of it. That's the account as she left it. That's what I have. There's a detail in my mother's account that I held back until now. Not because I was saving it for effect, but because I needed to get the main shape of the story out before I added something that changes the weight of it. About 3 weeks after the night in the woods, my mother took us back to Enumclaw to stay with her sister, Patrice. Patrice had a house on a side street off Roosevelt Avenue, a small rambler with a carport and a yard that backed up to a hedgerow. My mother and Tina and I shared the back bedroom. It was a tight arrangement, but a safe one, and my mother spent that time getting her footing back, figuring out what came next, dealing with the legal pieces that come with leaving a marriage in a state that required separation before divorce. About 10 days into that stay, my mother was in Patrice's backyard hanging laundry. It was a clear afternoon, cold but dry. The hedgerow behind the yard was bare alder and hawthorn, the kind of dense low growth that's all over the Enumclaw Plateau where the farmland starts giving way to the foothills. She heard something in the hedgerow, not a bird, not a dog from a neighboring yard, something larger, a single deliberate sound of weight shifting in brush. She stopped what she was doing. She looked at the hedgerow, and at the far end of it, maybe 40 feet away, she saw branches move. And above the branches, for just a moment, a shape, dark, high up, looking at her. She stood still. The shape stayed still. Then the branches settled and it was gone. She wrote about this in a short entry near the back of the legal pad, separate from the main account. She wrote, "I don't know what to make of this. Enumclaw is not the woods. There are fields and fences and subdivision streets, and a feed store and a high school. But it's also less than 20 miles from where we were, and there are corridors, the Green River bottomland, the farmland windbreaks, the foothills margin. Maybe that's possible. Or maybe I'm looking for it everywhere now. I don't know." I brought this to my sister when I found it. Tina was quiet for a while. Then she said she'd seen something similar, twice, in the weeks they were at Patrice's, once in the backyard, once in the alley behind the house. She'd never mentioned it to our mother because she was 9 years old, and she wasn't sure what she was seeing, and she didn't want to add to what was already a hard time. She said it felt like it was checking on us. I've thought about that for years. The specific phrase, the specificity of it. Not watching, not following, checking on, as if whatever it was had a relationship to the three of us, that included some obligation or some interest in our welfare that extended past the moment in the drainage. Tina is a careful person with language. She's a social worker, has been for 20 years, and she thinks about the words she uses. When she says checking on us, she means something different from being watched. She means an ongoing attention with a benevolent quality, the kind of attention that involves concern for well-being rather than surveillance. I've asked her whether she thought about the Enumclaw sightings as frightening in retrospect. She said no. She said she hadn't known what they were at the time, and that not knowing had made her cautious but not frightened, and that later when she understood what she was probably seeing, the fear she might have expected to feel retroactively didn't come. She said, "I think by the time I understood what I'd seen in Enumclaw, I already knew that it had been in the drainage with us, and I wasn't afraid of it in the drainage. So why would I be afraid of it in the alley? It had already done everything it was going to do to us, and what it had done was lit a fire." That is a remarkably clear statement about a remarkably strange situation, and I think it's true. The thing had already shown what it was going to do. It had shown it in the drainage, and it was consistent in the Enumclaw sightings, and the consistency is, in its own way, a kind of reassurance. I've thought about that a lot. The idea that something from those woods would follow them 20 miles to a neighborhood in Enumclaw is hard to fit into a naturalistic framework. I don't know how to explain it. What I'll say is that the Green River corridor is real. The bottomland along the Green River runs from the Cascade foothills through Auburn and down to Tukwila, and it's heavily vegetated the whole way, willows and cottonwood and dense brush that stays thick even in winter. A large, intelligent animal moving at night could use that corridor. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be possible in a way that daylight movement through suburbia wouldn't be. I've also read accounts from the BFRO database and from individual researchers of behavior that suggests Bigfoot don't simply vacate territory when humans move through it. There are patterns of what researchers call habituation, where a colony or individual returns to areas where encounters have happened, sometimes over extended periods. There are accounts of people being followed from the woods to the edges of towns. I don't know what to do with that information, except note that my mother and my sister described something consistent with it, independently, without knowing those accounts existed. That's the detail I held back. I want to stay with the Enumclaw sightings for another minute, because I think they're underweighted in my mother's account, and I've thought about them more than she let herself. The Green River corridor that I mentioned is genuinely viable as a movement route. The Green River runs west from the Cascade foothills through the cities of Auburn, Kent, and Renton, before eventually joining the Duwamish near Tukwila. From the mouth of the watershed in the foothills near Enumclaw to the urban fringe, the bottomland vegetation is dense and largely unbroken. Cottonwood, red alder, Himalayan blackberry thickets that are impenetrable in summer and still thick in winter. Willow stands along the channel margins. The corridor isn't wide, maybe a quarter mile in most places, but it's continuous. At night, in December of 1987, that corridor would have been very dark. There were no trail systems along the river at that point. The industrial areas that now press against the river in the lower reaches were smaller then. For something moving in the dark along the river's edge, keeping to the brush, it would have been possible to travel from the foothills to within a few miles of Enumclaw without crossing a significant open area. My mother saw it in a hedgerow in a backyard. Tina saw it in an alley and a backyard. 3 sightings over maybe 2 weeks, all within a few blocks of Patrice's house on the southeast side of Enumclaw, the side closest to the foothills. I don't know what to do with this. I'm not going to pretend it resolves into a clean picture. The behavior is consistent with what researchers describe as ranging, the movement of an individual across a wide area, often returning to or following something. In this case, 3 people it had been close to for a night in a drainage. What I can say is that my mother and my sister both saw something in a neighborhood 20 miles from those woods, in the weeks immediately after that night, and neither of them told the other until 32 years later when I found the note in the pages. That's the detail I held back. Now I want to talk about the physical evidence, such as it is. My mother wrote down the track dimensions: 16 to 17 inches long, 5 toes, narrow heel, 4-foot stride at a walking pace. She was a hunter's daughter, and she was specific about these things. I've already mentioned that these dimensions fall within the documented range for Pacific Northwest track reports. What I want to add is the terrain context. Huckleberry Creek runs through a drainage that's typical for that elevation in the Clearwater State Forest. The soil at the creek level is a silt-clay mix, the kind of substrate that takes and holds impressions well. Even in December, after snow, there would have been soft ground at the creek margin and along the lower slope of the drainage where the water table sits high. The fact that my mother found readable tracks in the morning is consistent with that terrain. Deep snow would have preserved the impressions through the night and the early morning before any melt. Stride length is worth spending a minute on. A 4-foot stride at a walking pace implies a leg length and height that don't match any human. A stride of 4 feet while walking, not running, means the creature is placing its foot approximately 4 feet ahead of where the previous foot was, which for a human requires a height of over 7 feet to achieve comfortably. The stride length in the documented Bigfoot track record typically ranges from 3.5 to 5 feet, correlating with reported height estimates in the 7 to 9 foot range. My mother estimated the shape she saw in the tree line at something well over 6 feet, possibly 7. These are consistent. Jeff Meldrum's work includes detailed analysis of what he calls the mid-tarsal break, a flexibility in the midfoot that shows up in track evidence as a distinctive pressure ridge behind the ball of the foot. What the track evidence suggests, if Meldrum's analysis is right, is a foot that's partially rigid, partially flexible, the kind of structural adaptation you'd expect in a primate that transitioned to bipedalism relatively recently in evolutionary terms. My mother didn't observe that detail. She wasn't a trained tracker, and snow conditions would have made fine morphological detail hard to read anyway. What she observed were the broad dimensions and the basic toe structure. But those observations are consistent with the body of physical evidence that exists. The account is coherent. She wasn't describing something that violates what we know about the landscape or the documented record. The possibility that she saw what she said she saw has to be taken seriously. My mother rebuilt her life in Enumclaw after the divorce was finalized. She got a job at the county assessor's office, which suited her precise, methodical approach to things. She was good at it, and she stayed there for 22 years. She raised Tina and me in a rented house on a street where the neighbor kids could come over and the windows let in light. She dated a couple of people over the years, nothing that lasted, and she said once when I asked her about it that she'd gotten very particular about who she let into her space. My mother was extremely good at her work at the assessor's office. Her supervisor for the first decade described her to me. When I contacted him after she died, as the most organized person he'd ever worked with, he said she had a system for everything, and the system always made sense. I think the legal pad is evidence of it. 40 pages of handwriting, organized chronologically, with margin notes that are themselves organized, dates wherever she knew them, honest question marks wherever she didn't. The work of someone who understood that a record is only as good as its accuracy. She bought the legal pad in 1994, 7 years after the night in the woods. She made a false start, 2 pages crossed out, then started again cleaner. The first entry is spare, almost clinical. Date, location, weather conditions, names of participants. It reads like an incident report. By the 10th page, the handwriting stays precise but grows more personal, and she starts speculating more openly, crossing things out not because they're wrong, but because she's found a better word. By the final pages, it reads like letters she's writing to someone she knows well. She went back to it periodically over the years. The dates she added span from 1994 to 2018. Some years there are several entries, some years none. She was not keeping a diary. She was working something out. She never talked about Gerald, and she never talked about December 1987, except to me and Tina, once each, in summary form. When I was 16, she sat me down and told me the main outline of the story without the detail she'd eventually put in the pages. She said, "Something in those woods helped us. I've never been able to explain it, and I've stopped trying. What I know is that we're alive, and I'm grateful, and I think about it almost every day." She didn't ask me to believe her. She didn't frame it as something I needed to do anything with. She just said it like a fact she was putting on record, the way she put facts on record at the assessor's office. Date, location, what happened, end of description. I believed her. I was 16, and I believed her without needing any more information than that. My mother was not a woman who invented things. I want to talk about the fire again, because it's the part of the account I find the most remarkable. Not because it's the most dramatic, but because of what it implies. Building a fire is not something an animal does. A chimpanzee can learn to use fire given extended training in captivity. A group of chimps at a sanctuary in Sweden learned to use matches and kept an outdoor fire going for brief periods. But no non-human primate in the wild has been documented deliberately building and lighting a fire. It's considered one of the cognitive thresholds that separates human cognition from other primate cognition. The intentional construction of combustion, gathering fuel, arranging it for optimal burning, applying an ignition source in a controlled way, requires planning that operates across a causal chain of more than 2 or 3 steps. My mother's account says that a dry branch was broken from a standing dead tree, leaned against a boulder, surrounded with smaller material, and lit. That's a fire lay. A simple one, the kind you'd make if you needed a fire fast, and you weren't trying to impress anyone but a fire lay. It's a deliberate technical construction, and it worked. In December, in the Cascades, in snow, with a woman and 2 small children who needed it. Whatever built it understood what they needed. That's the part that sits with me. There are people who believe that the intelligence attributed to these beings in indigenous oral traditions and in accounts like my mother's is exaggerated by fear and projection, that what witnesses are doing is anthropomorphizing an unknown primate, reading intention and awareness into behavior that's better explained by instinct or coincidence. I've tried to take that seriously. I've tried to apply it to my mother's account. I can't make the fire into coincidence or instinct. A standing dead tree in a drainage doesn't spontaneously break, arrange itself against a boulder, and ignite. Something made choices, a sequence of choices that resulted in warmth for 3 people who needed warmth. Something in a drainage above Greenwater, Washington in December of 1987 looked at 3 people who were cold and lost in the dark and understood what they needed and built them a fire. Whatever else we say about it, that's the thing it did. That is what it means to say a fire appeared 20 feet from where they sheltered. Maybe that's the limit of what we can know. Maybe all we can say is that something in those woods made choices, and one of those choices kept us alive, and we don't have the right framework to fully understand what or why. Maybe that's enough. My mother thought it was enough. She didn't need it to resolve into a category. She needed it to be true, and it was true, and she carried it. There's another thing I want to address, which is the question of why it happened. My mother didn't speculate much about this in the pages. She wrote that she'd thought about what it might have gotten from the encounter, and said she didn't know. I've been thinking about it since she died, and I have some ideas, which I'll offer with the appropriate uncertainty. The pattern in the strongest Bigfoot accounts, the ones that have the quality of something real rather than something invented, often involves some version of what happened to my mother. Not the dramatic confrontation, the fleeing, the screaming in the dark. The quieter version, something that could hurt you, that is clearly capable of hurting you, that knows you're there and makes the active choice not to. Something that in some cases takes a further step, providing something, leaving something, doing something that has no predatory or territorial explanation. These aren't all the same. There are plenty of accounts that involve aggression, rock throwing, the sense of being stalked. The landscape of documented encounters is not uniformly benign, but within the accounts that feel most grounded, the ones with specific sensory detail and internally consistent witness behavior, there's a notable subset where the encounter ends in something other than threat, something that reads like acknowledged presence. Two kinds of being in the same space, aware of each other, and arriving at a temporary arrangement. My mother arrived at that arrangement by accident. She walked into those woods because there was nowhere else to go, and something that lived there met her in circumstances that made the calculus obvious. She was not a threat. She was cold and lost, and she had 2 children. Whatever assessment was made about her in those dark hours was made on the basis of what she was, which was a woman trying to keep her kids alive. She passed that assessment. I've spent time with that idea because it's the part of my mother's account that I find hardest to hold in one thought. The idea of being assessed, the idea that something in those trees was making a determination about what she was and what she warranted. There's a detail from the pages that I keep returning to, something small that comes in a passage she wrote about the hour before. The fire appeared. She wrote that at some point during the sitting, during the long quiet, with the knife in her hands, and the smell in the air, and the pressure of something very close and very still, she thought about her daughters, not in a panicked way, in a specific way. She thought about Tina sitting beside her, with her arm through my mother's arm, rigid and quiet, 8 years old, and managing it. And she thought about me on my mother's lap, half asleep, not knowing enough to be as scared as I should have been. She wrote, I remember thinking very clearly that I was what stood between them and the cold and whatever was in those trees. And I remember thinking that I was not enough for that job, but that I was what there was. And I put the knife across my knees where I could reach it fast, and I stayed still, and I did not run. I've read that passage probably 50 times since she died. What strikes me is what she didn't write. She didn't write that she was praying, although she would later. She didn't write that she was making deals or promises. She just described what she did, which was to stay still and stay between us and the dark. And whatever was in those trees, reading her the way it apparently read her, saw that. A woman who was not a hunter, not a threat, not someone with any relationship to that forest at all. Just a person in the wrong place, trying to stay between her children and the cold. My mother thought later that this might have been the whole of it. The whole reason, not some complex calculation about human-wildlife relations or the ethics of an undiscovered species deciding to intervene. Just something old and present, recognizing something it recognized, a parent holding their ground over their young. She wrote, maybe that's a thing every living creature that's ever raised young knows the shape of. Maybe that's the oldest thing there is. I don't know if that's right. I think it might be. I think if you've raised anything, if you've ever been the thing standing between something you love and the dark, you know the posture. You know the exact quality of that stillness. And if something in those woods had been watching long enough and living long enough to know the shape of every living thing in those drainages, maybe it knew that posture too. Maybe it knew it very well. I don't know if there's a framework in which that's anything other than what it appears to be. The forest people, to use the nonspecific term my mother would have preferred, have lived in those Cascade drainages for a very long time. They know the terrain, they know the weather, they know the difference between a hunter and a refugee. And on a night in December of 1987, one of them, or more than one, decided that a refugee with 2 small children in the cold was worth a fire. That's the story. I'll add one more thing and then I'll close. My mother went back to church in her late 40s. She'd lapsed after the marriage, which I think was about reclaiming a space Gerald had poisoned with his opinions about it, and she came back to a small Methodist congregation in Enumclaw that she attended until she died. She wasn't evangelical about it. She didn't push it on Tina or me. She just went on Sunday mornings and seemed to find something useful there. She was not someone who used the word grace lightly. She had a Methodist upbringing that had lapsed in her 20s and returned in her late 40s, and her return to it was not the return of a converted person. It was quieter than that. She found something useful in the practice of it, and she held on to that without needing to defend the doctrine or argue about the theology. She went on Sunday mornings, and she was glad to go, and she came home, having gotten something she didn't get anywhere else. When I was in my 20s and knew everything, I asked her once what she actually believed about God. She thought about it for a while and then said, "I believe the world is bigger than what I can measure. I believe there are things in it that operate by their own logic and don't need my understanding to function. That seems like enough to build something on." I've thought about that a lot in the years since. It seems to me now like a position that was shaped by December 1987, by something that operated by its own logic and didn't need her understanding to function, and nonetheless lit a fire for her in the dark. She connected those things explicitly in the last year. She said, "When I think about grace as a theological concept, the thing that comes to me is that night, something that could have done anything it wanted and chose to do the right thing. I don't know if that's what the word is supposed to mean, but that's what I know of it from experience. I don't have a way to evaluate the theology. What I have is a woman who spent most of her adult life with a story she couldn't tell anyone, and who found a framework that held it without shrinking it, and who went on Sunday mornings and seemed to find something useful there. In the last year of her life, she told me that when she thought about the night in the woods and about whatever built that fire, she put it in a category she called grace. She said she didn't know if that word was accurate, but it was the word she had for receiving something you needed that you hadn't earned and couldn't repay. She said whatever happened that night came from outside anything she'd done or deserved, arrived without explanation, and kept her children alive. She said, "I don't need it to fit into anything. I just need to know it was real." I know it was real. Tina knows it was real. The 40 pages of handwriting are real. The tracks were real. The fire was real. Dale Forsyth's truck pulling up to a Forest Service pullout east of Greenwater on a cold December morning and finding a woman and 2 kids wrapped in an emergency blanket was real. The rest is what we do with it. I've been doing this, telling stories from the edges of documented experience, for a while now. I do it because I think the edges are where the most honest things happen. When the frameworks we carry into the world stop being adequate for what we encounter, we either flatten the encounter to fit the framework or we widen the framework. Most people flatten. My mother didn't. She widened. She spent 32 years with a story that didn't fit anything she'd been given, and she held it without crushing it into a shape it wasn't. That seems like the right thing to do with something true. I've been thinking about what it means to keep a story for 32 years and then hand it to someone. What the handing over means. My mother gave me those pages and said she needed someone to have it, and I've been sitting with what that means to her and what it asks of me. There's a difference between having something and doing something with it. She had it for 32 years without doing anything with it except carry it. And that wasn't nothing. That was a significant thing she did with it. She held it intact. She didn't let it get simplified or distorted by the telling. She didn't let it become a party story, or a thing she was known for, or a badge of having survived something unusual. She kept it as it was, a specific night in December 1987 with specific details and a specific meaning that she wasn't going to let the world talk her out of. What I'm doing with it now, telling it to strangers, is something different. I'm not sure she would have told it this way. I think she might have kept it to the pages and handed those pages to someone and let them decide. But Tina was the one who first suggested this, and Tina is right that telling it means more people can have it. More people can decide for themselves what to make of it. More people can measure it against their own experience and their own knowledge of these woods and these traditions and these animals, or whatever these things are, and come to their own conclusions. What I ask is just this. Hold it the way she held it. Don't simplify it, don't explain it away, and don't inflate it either. It's a specific night, and it was real, and 3 people are alive because of it. And whatever we call the thing that made that true, it made a choice, and the choice was toward life. That's what it is. That's all it needs to be. The Clearwater State Forest is still there. The drainage is still there. In winter, when the snow comes down on the Cascades, and the temperatures drop into the 20s, and the forest goes quiet in the way it goes quiet, something is still out there. Something old and large and intelligent, and largely uninterested in us except when we stumble into its territory in a condition that warrants attention. I hope it's still keeping track. I hope whatever accounting it keeps includes 3 people in a drainage in December of 1987 and a debt that was paid with fire. The second time I went back was October 2022. I drove up from Enumclaw on a Tuesday morning in cold overcast, rain that couldn't decide if it was rain or mist. I parked at a pullout I thought was near where Dale Forsyth would have found them. I'm not certain of the specific location because my mother described terrain, not coordinates, and terrain is interpretive. But the drainage I walked into felt right in a way I'm not going to oversell. I walked for about 2 hours, found the creek, found a section of drainage that fit the shape she'd written about. A hillside above the water, with old fir on the slope, and a flat area near a large boulder that could have been where she sat. The trees were big enough that the sky disappeared above them. The drainage was deep enough that the sound of the road was gone within a few minutes of walking in. The only sounds were the creek and the wind. I left what I brought. I looked at the uphill tree line for a while. Nothing moved. I'll go back. I don't know what I'm looking for exactly, or I know, but I can't say it in terms that make sense, which is that I want to be in the place where something decided my mother was worth keeping alive, and I want to feel whatever is still there, if anything is, and I want it to know that the debt she felt has not been forgotten. That's probably too much to ask of a drainage in the Clearwater State Forest, but I'll keep going back. I think about my mother. I think about her walking out a back door into the dark with a butcher knife, and 2 small children, and no plan, and everything behind her that made the forest seem safe by comparison. I think about her sitting against a fir tree in the cold with Tina and me inside her coat, knowing the flashlight was dead, and knowing she was lost, and knowing the temperature was still dropping. And then the fire. She earned the right to that story. She earned it by surviving and by being honest about what happened and by writing it down in 40 handwritten pages on a legal pad, and handing it to me before she died. I've been thinking about what honoring it means in practice. It means saying plainly, my mother was in a forest above Greenwater, Washington, in December of 1987, and she was cold and lost and frightened, and something in those woods built her a fire. It means not hedging that into something easier to receive. My mother stopped hedging sometime in her late 40s or early 50s, as best I can tell from the pages. The later entries don't qualify, they describe. She saw what she saw, and she said what she said, and she let it sit there without apology. I'm trying to do the same thing. Here is what I know. My mother and my sister and I are alive because something in those woods decided to help her when she needed help. Whatever the thing was, it existed. It made choices. It built a fire and stood watch and chose a distance and held that distance all night and was gone before morning. Those are its actions. I don't have a name for what does those things. I have the actions. Tina and I agreed that the right thing to do with the legal pad is to make sure it stays intact. The actual handwriting, Lorraine Mead's actual handwriting in pencil on legal pad paper, is real and specific, and that specificity is what makes it true. The legal pad is in a fireproof box in my house. Tina has a photocopy of every page. I'm trying to honor that, make sure someone else has it. She made me promise I'm keeping it. There's something I haven't addressed directly, and I want to get to it, because it comes up whenever this kind of account is presented to people who are skeptical. The question of motive. Not the creature's motive, my mother's. The question of why someone would make this up, or embellish it, or allow a traumatic night in the woods to reshape into something it wasn't. It's a fair question. Memory under stress is not reliable. Adrenaline, cold, exhaustion. All of these degrade the accuracy of what we perceive and what we later remember. So I'll apply that honestly. Could the shape she saw in the tree line have been a combination of shadow and ambient snowlight, that her frightened brain assembled into a figure? Possibly. Could the sounds she heard, footsteps at the creek, branches moving, vocalization she described as organized, have been deer, elk, a falling snag, wind through the drainage? Possibly. The fire is not possible. I keep coming back to the fire. I've thought hard about whether there's a naturalistic explanation for a burning branch, leaning against a boulder appearing 20 feet from where they sheltered, in December, in snow, at night, in the middle of a forest drainage with no human presence. I've thought about lightning strikes, which do ignite wood, but not in that organized way, and not in those weather conditions. The storm was snow, not lightning. I've thought about dry wood spontaneously combusting, which doesn't happen in cold weather. I've thought about whether someone else was in those woods that night, a hiker or a hunter who might have built a fire and moved on, a hiker or a hunter who built a fire and walked away from it in the dark in December on a remote drainage trail in the Clearwater State Forest, and left it burning near people they apparently didn't notice or didn't bother to speak to. That explanation requires more improbability than the alternative. My mother knew this. She wrote, I was a rational person before that night, and I stayed a rational person after it. I don't believe things easily, but I watched that fire burn, and I felt the heat of it on my face, and I know it was not there before I heard something cross that creek. Those two facts together don't leave much room. They don't. There's also the question of what my mother did in the aftermath. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't contact researchers or news outlets. She didn't post about it when the internet became a place where you could post about things. She held it for 32 years and told her daughters and wrote 40 pages of handwriting and died with it mostly unspoken. People who fabricate encounter stories tell them early and often and with escalating detail. My mother told this story exactly twice before she wrote it down, once to Tina and once to me, both times stripped of detail, trimmed to what she thought was most verifiable. Tina corroborates the fire. She was 8 years old, and she corroborates that fire appeared, that it burned for a long time, and that there was something at the edge of the light. Those two elements of my mother's account are independently supported by a child who had no reason to invent them, and every reason to have suppressed or forgotten them over 40 years. Core sensory impressions from childhood tend to stick. The fire stuck. The shape stuck. I'll move on to something I've been wanting to address, which is the geography in more detail, because it matters for understanding what kind of animal or being could have been present in that place at that time. The Clearwater State Forest is managed by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. It covers approximately 12,000 acres in King County, in the foothills between Enumclaw and the Cascade crest. The forest is contiguous with several other large blocks of public and private timber land to the east and south. The William O. Douglas Wilderness, which begins roughly at the Cascade crest, is about 8 miles east of the area my mother was in that night. Between the state forest and the wilderness boundary, there's a mix of private timber holdings, national forest land, and state land that adds up to a continuous corridor of relatively undisturbed forest extending for miles in every direction. The human footprint in that corridor in 1987 was lighter than it is now. There was less sport hiking. The logging was active on private land, but the state forest parcels and the national forest were seeing less pressure than in earlier decades. The road network was present, but not dense at higher elevations in December. In short, on a December night in 1987, the drainage below Huckleberry Creek was about as isolated from human activity as any area 20 miles from a major highway gets in western Washington. The ecosystem is Douglas fir and western red cedar at lower elevations, transitioning to subalpine fir and mountain hemlock as you gain elevation. Annual precipitation in that zone runs around 80 inches. Wildlife is the full Cascade package: black-tailed deer, Roosevelt elk, black bear, mountain lion, coyote. A large, undocumented primate in that corridor would have food. The deer and elk populations are substantial and year-round. Huckleberry Creek drains into the White River drainage, which has Chinook and coho salmon runs every year. The food base that would support a large omnivore in the Pacific Northwest is exactly what that ecosystem provides. The forest between the Enumclaw Plateau and the Cascade Crest also provides cover that's unusual for a place so close to a population center. The second-growth Douglas fir in that area is dense enough that visibility from the ground is limited to a few tens of feet in most directions. Something large could move through it unseen in daylight, let alone at night. And the distance from the nearest occupied dwelling to the drainage my mother was in that night was more than 2 miles, by trail. I've looked at aerial imagery of that area from the late 1980s. The forest cover is continuous and thick. The 2-track my mother followed back from the house is visible as a faint line into the canopy, but disappears within a short distance. The drainage itself is hidden. From above, it's just forest. In short, the habitat is right. The food base is right. The cover is right. The isolation is right. If something lives in the Cascades that we haven't catalogued, the Clearwater foothills in December is exactly the kind of place it would be. I've also spent some time on what it means for a being to be present at close range for hours without showing itself fully. My mother's account describes a presence that chose how much to reveal at each point. It crossed the creek and let itself be heard. It came close enough that the smell arrived. It built the fire from a distance. It stayed at the periphery of the firelight without entering it. In the morning, the tracks came to within 20 feet and stopped. That's a sequence of calibrated disclosures. Each one gave something without giving everything. Tom Powell, a biology teacher in Oregon who spent decades in the field and wrote a detailed analysis of encounter patterns, argues that the intelligence on display in the most credible accounts isn't animal intelligence operating on instinct. It's something closer to strategic intelligence, the ability to model another being's state of mind and adjust behavior accordingly. The kind of intelligence that knows a frightened woman will be more calmed by fire than by proximity. Whatever was on that hillside gave warmth without requiring anyone to see it clearly. It preserved my mother's ability to process the encounter at her own pace rather than forcing a confrontation that might have been too much to handle at all. That's considerate. By any definition I have available, that's considerate. I don't know what to make of that. I'm a person living in a world with a particular set of frameworks, and none of them were built to accommodate something that was considerate to my mother on a hillside in 1987, and also doesn't officially exist. But I've stopped needing the frameworks to catch up. The thing happened. My mother wrote it down. I'm telling it now. The last piece I want to address is the question of the broader pattern, because I think it matters for how you receive this account. Washington State has the most Bigfoot reports per capita of any state in the country, according to the BFRO database, which holds over 5,000 reports from Washington alone. A significant proportion come from the Cascade foothills, the same elevation band and forest type as the Clearwater drainage. Many of those reports involve the same elements my mother described, the smell arriving before any visual, something large at the periphery of vision in low light, the bipedal movement, the calibrated distance keeping. A smaller subset describes something protective rather than threatening, encounters where distress on the witness's part seems to change the character of the being's behavior. I read about 60 of those accounts in detail over the last year, not to validate my mother's, but to understand whether what she described fits a pattern or sits outside it. That fits. Clearly and specifically, it fits. What that means, I'll leave to you. What it means to me is that whatever my mother encountered that night was not a once-in-history event. It was one instance of an ongoing presence that's been here longer than the state forest designation, longer than the logging roads, longer than any of the frameworks we've layered over that landscape. Something that lives there and knows the terrain, and occasionally, for reasons it keeps to itself, does something kind. I should say something about my own relationship to these woods, because I'm asking you to receive this account through my telling, and you should know what I bring to it. I grew up in Enumclaw, and I've been going into the Cascades my whole life. Not as a serious hiker or a hunter, just as someone who lives near them and goes in when I need to, the way people go to the beach when they live near the ocean. I know the difference between the Cascades in summer and the Cascades in winter. I know what the forest sounds like in dead calm and what it sounds like in wind. I know what a deer sounds like crashing through brush, and I know that it sounds nothing like something large moving deliberately. I know what a coyote sounds like, and I know what a coyote pack sounds like, and I know what it sounds like when the coyotes stop. I have never had an encounter myself. I want to say that clearly. I've been in those woods many times, and I've never seen anything I couldn't explain, and I've never heard anything that required an explanation beyond what I already knew. What I have is my mother's 40 pages, and my sister's memories, and a lifetime of knowing Lorraine Mead well enough to know what she was not, which was a person who invented things. I'm not a believer in the sense that I arrived at this already believing. I arrived at it through a specific document written by a specific person I trusted, and I've spent several years since she died checking the document against everything I can check it against. The geography is accurate. The ecology is accurate. The track dimensions are consistent with the documented evidence base. The behavioral pattern she described is consistent with accounts from credible witnesses over decades. The detail about the fire is not something I can verify, but it is also not something I can explain away. That's where I am. Not a true believer, and not a skeptic. Someone who read his mother's account and found it credible, and has been trying to do right by it since she died. My mother called it grace. The Puyallup and Muckleshoot people have older names for it, embedded in traditions that go back thousands of years to a time before the landscape was divided into state and national and private parcels. I don't have the right to use those names, and I won't. But I'll say that the traditions exist, that they're specific about the being's nature and behavior, that they include the quality of encounter my mother had, and that they were formed by people who knew this country before anyone else did and knew what lived in it. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. My mother is buried in Enumclaw, small cemetery on the south side of town. The Cascade foothills are visible from the cemetery on clear days, the long dark line of Douglas fir against the sky, Mount Rainier above everything. She would have wanted to be somewhere she could see those hills. She spent the last decades of her life within sight of the place she'd fled from, and the place that saved her, which I think says something about what she made peace with. She didn't fear the woods. She never feared the woods after that night. She feared Gerald, and she feared what Gerald represented, and the woods became the opposite of that. The place where the thing that found them was nothing like Gerald, was, in fact, the furthest thing from Gerald she could imagine. I'm going to close with what she wrote at the very end of the 40 pages, the last entry, the one dated about a month before she died. I'm going to read it as exactly as I can. She wrote, "I have tried to write this down as plainly as I know how. I have tried to say what I saw and not more than what I saw. I don't have a name for what helped us that night, and I'm not sure a name would add anything. What I have is the fact of the fire, the fact that my children were alive in the morning, the fact that something in those woods made a choice that I am still, 32 years later, grateful for. I hope whatever it was knows that. I hope there's a way for something like that to know that a woman who is dying in a town 20 miles from where it found her has been grateful her whole life. I don't know if that matters to it. I think maybe it does. The kind of intelligence that can see what someone needs and provide it without being asked. That kind of intelligence probably understands gratitude. I'll leave it at that. I love you, Deb. I love Tina. Make sure someone else has it." Her name was Lorraine Mead, and she was 61 years old, and she walked out a back door in December of 1987 with nowhere to go, and something in the forest kept her alive. Make sure someone else has it. I'm working on that, Mom. I promise I'm working.